Hey guys, you are listening to the Unruly Doctor podcast, a podcast about life, metaphysics, current events, politics, and anything I find interesting. Please subscribe to our channel and like this episode so that we can grow and reach a bigger audience. Enjoy the episode. Hey guys, Dr. Bain here for another episode of the Unruly Doctor podcast. I've got one of my patients here with me, Dan Comfort. Dan, say hey to everybody.
Hello, everybody.
So Dan's one of my patients, and he's a dedicated follower of Christ, and I thought it would be a really interesting episode to kind of dig into Christianity. And, you know, Dan's a really, really devout guy, and, you know, him and I have had really long philosophical conversations in between treatments and things like that. And, you know, me and Dan talked about it a couple months back about having Dan come on and having a conversation about it. You know, I'm not personally a Christian, but I am also for sure a big believer that Jesus was a real guy, did a lot of wonderful things, was an incredible healer, was all this and this and this and this. So Dan, why don't you give everybody a little bit of introduction, your background, you know, from, you know, as a kid and stuff like that, you know, talk more about Christianity in your life and how it kind of shaped you.
Sure. So my family was officially Episcopal, but
Okay.
they weren't religious.
Sure.
And I kind of got turned off of it at an early age because my parents stopped going to church, but they would
Right.
kick their four boys out the door and say, go to church.
Yeah.
So that really wasn't interesting to me.
Right.
But I always had a spiritual need, so I was always asking questions and always looking at other religions. I always had a bias for the Bible. I believe
Sure.
the Bible.
Sure.
But as I got older, I needed to prove to myself that, a couple of things. Number one, that we were created.
Right.
And then I also had to prove to myself that the Bible is from God.
Right.
Otherwise,
What's the point?
Yeah, why would you live your life by a book if you don't believe it's from a higher source?
Right.
So that's kind of like the beginning, and looked at a lot of different religions. Again, proved to myself that the Bible is from God. And after college, I actually was baptized as one of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Oh, sure.
But and I say that with respect for all other religions.
Sure.
You know, if you're going to practice a religion, you know, I hope you would say that this is the true religion.
Right.
This is the right way.
Yeah, full belief in it. You're not kind of half of it.
Right. Whether you're a Catholic or a Jew or whatever you are.
Right.
If you're doing something, you know, I hope that that's what you believe. But that's what, you know, it took me through, I'd say my mid-20s before I really settled on that. And
I got it. So did you do the stereotypical Jehovah's Witness where you're going door to door? Were you doing a lot of recruitment and things like that and giving out Bibles and saying things like that? Okay.
I do.
So for a lot of people out there, like myself, you know, that's the only part of Jehovah's Witnesses that I've seen really, right? Because unless I think you're really digging into being a Jehovah's Witness, then obviously you don't really see the inner workings of how do they get, you know, what's the big differences then in terms of, say, a Jehovah's Witness versus Episcopalian versus, I mean, there's so many versions, and you and I discussed this a little bit, I think, at times, where I think that's where a lot of people, right, like myself, who are on the spiritual end, but who definitely see a lot of the values and things like that, and in my personal opinion, right, that Jesus was real and a lot of these things, right? But, you know, I think a lot of the things that ended up putting people off like myself is, right, when we talk to Christians, there's so many versions of Christianity, and that's where it gets lost for a lot of people, right? Because, you know, I ask one Christian his perspective or her perspective on this, and then I get, you know, someone else talks about the same thing and says, well, and then they have their kind of a different version of a similar thing, right? Mm-hmm. So where do you feel that in your life you've had to kind of skirt around those things and obviously seek for deeper truths and things and not be influenced by a lot of that stuff? You know, how do you end up picking one if there's so many?
Sure.
You know?
So I use the Bible as my
direct guide.
My guide.
Right.
And I had to prove to myself that I believed that was from God. And if you study it, you'll find there are many things that prove it is from God.
Sure.
For instance, you know, the Bible talked about the earth being a sphere hanging on nothing.
Right.
Well, that was thousands of years ago when people thought the earth was on top of Atlas.
Right.
Or a turtle.
Or flat, I would imagine.
Yes. So
Right.
It's things like that show that, wait a minute, you know, if this is from God,
right,
it's going to be accurate. It's not a history book. It's not a science book. But when it touches on those things, it's going to be accurate.
Right.
And so when you look at things like that, it's like, okay, the Bible had it right when mankind didn't quite have all the knowledge they needed at that point.
Sure.
It's hanging on nothing versus on top of a man or a turtle.
Sure.
And there's many, many things like that.
Right. So, in terms of things like that, right? I mean, sometimes when I've studied the Bible and things like that, and I could probably go deeper than I have, you know what I mean? And I think for a lot of people, and once again, I hope and everyone who's listening to this, I'm just here to invest. We're here investigating. We're here having a conversation. I would love to have conversations with other religions and things too, to ask a lot of questions. But Christianity obviously is, arguably one of the most known and one of the most studied of probably all religions, besides maybe, Hinduism and things like that, Buddhism and other ones, right? But in terms of Christianity, religion, and things like that, you said, we're looking for proof, I'm looking for things, right? So that's one given example. I think a lot of people will have pushback on some of these things sometimes, right? So one of the ones that I have felt pushback when I was studying the Bible was, in particular, right, a lot of people in terms of creationism, right? So there's, creationism is a sect almost, or not every Christian is a creationist in their terms of personal belief. They obviously hold certain parts of creationism, but when I watch, say, a creationist and they're talking about the earth is 6,000 years old, right? That's a common thing I hear, right? And obviously that was one of the turnoffs for me, right? Because with at least decent scientific certainty, we've found historical sites that are like 14,000 years old with humans obviously building that, right? So what do you feel about things like that? Or does that make you question things ever? Or, what have you done to kind of satiate those questionings that come from things like that?
No, that's a sort of question I had to answer to myself.
Sure.
And that thought, with due respect for people who believe that, it's not accurate.
Right.
Go to the encyclopedia, look up the word day. When the Bible talks about creative days.
Right.
When it talks about Abraham Lincoln's day, what's it talking about?
Right.
It's not talking about a 24-hour period. It's talking about a time frame. Mm-hmm. In fact, when you look at the creative days in the Bible, one of the days encompasses several of the other days.
Sure.
So it's not a 24-hour period.
Right.
It's a time period. So the earth and the universe, could have taken millions of years to make.
Right.
When you look at the time period, so it's broken down for us so that we can understand, okay, this is what happened first, and then second. First day, second day, third day, but it's not 24 hours.
Right.
It's a time period.
Right. Do you feel that some of these things hold certain things back? Do you feel like, when someone is really passionate about something like that, like, you know what I mean? I'm not thinking of the guy's name, but I'm sure you've seen him on the internet. There's a college professor, I think he's a college professor, that he's a pretty big creationist, and he's kind of like the forefront of creationism. You see him debating atheists a lot of times in different debates and things like that, and he's really strict about this 6,000 thing, or that, a lot of this. And do you feel like stuff like that actually hurts the case?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because let's say you're not religious.
Right.
And like yourself, you're looking at these things, kind of taking in
You're trying to be
information.
objective.
You hear someone say, the universe is 7,000 years old.
Right.
And you say to yourself, that's not true.
Right.
It's billions of years old.
Sure.
He's wrong. So why should I listen to anything else that person says? Right.
And that's what I think what happens a lot of times too, is sometimes people say things like that when they're very serious about wanting others to be a part of this, right?
He might believe that, but
sure.
It's really not accurate.
Right.
It's just not. I mean, it's not what the Bible teaches.
Of course. Yeah, and that's I think the tough thing for a lot of people like myself too, because I grew up or was raised around, I should say, more of, right? Because I think grew up as if you're really involved and you're doing it, maybe more surrounded by it as if your environment is that way, but you may not prescribe to it, right? So, you know what I mean? My mom was a very harsh Catholic style, Christian. And I think she was a kind of a big source of really pushing me away almost from Christianity because of how she did it, right? It was almost like religion was a punishment and not like a building of something, right? Versus there's plenty of religious folks out there. And today we're just talking about Christianity, but I'm just pulling out from general, right? Where, many times religion is the foundation or the building of a family many times, right? So in Christianity, right, husband and wife have kids, populate the earth, having dinner together, breaking bread, right? Jesus and the apostles, right? These types of things where it's like building a family structure. And that's a big thing. The big debate of today is family structure and what should it look like, right? And that's getting those boundaries pushed, right? Traditional Judeo-Christian values are being put into question in the last decade or so, a lot more than I think in quite some time. You know, I think historically Judeo-Christian values and belief systems were the standard, and now there's a lot of these other things coming in and they're clashing, right? So almost like a culture war, which is a lot of people are talking about. So as time's going on and more of this clash is coming in, how do you think religion is going to play the biggest role in the future as people's minds are changing about these things and giving more pushback? And you see where I'm falling with that?
Sure. So, you know, as far as religion goes,
Right.
you know, faith is something that's talked about a lot.
That's big, yeah.
Faith is not credulity.
Right.
Faith is not believe this because I told you to believe it.
Right.
The Bible actually defines it. And it says it's the assured expectation of things hoped for, the evident demonstration of reality, so not beheld.
Right.
So it's based on facts, realities.
Right.
So you see the wind blow, you see the tree move.
Right.
Well, you know the wind's there, you can't see it,
Right.
but you see the effects of it.
Right.
So that's what faith is. You're believing something, but it's not that there's no facts or proof behind it.
Right.
There are. So that's different than saying, look, you know, I raised you, and this is my religion, and this is what you're going to be.
Right.
There's no basis for that. There's no facts. I mean, you need something more than that.
Right.
You know, not credulity.
Well, I think you're right, because a lot of times, I mean, once again, like in my situation, that was the situation that was going on, right? And of course, I mean, human nature is when someone does that kind of pushback and stuff like that. No, you're not. You know what I mean?
Well, and like me when I was a kid, you know,
Right.
we're staying in bed
Right.
on Saturday morning. You kids go. You know,
Right.
and as we walk around the corner, I was the youngest. You know, we're hitting each other and kicking each
Yeah.
other. It's
You're
like this ain't a lot of fun for me.
trying to avoid going.
You go in there, the one brother's out back smoking a cigarette,
Yep.
and you're just bored out of your mind. It's ritual, you know, and you don't understand what's going on. That's not something that you're drawn to.
Right.
So, you know, now some people, you know, a lot of people's religion is determined by their family,
Right.
or they're living on this corner and right down the street's a church.
Right.
With me, I needed to take a more, I don't know what you would say, a more
Investigative approach.
I had
or
to investigate.
Personal.
I had to prove it to myself.
Right. Right. Right.
And so, you know, that's why I looked at, you know, where we created. It's the Bible from God. And that's how I approached it.
Do you think there's value with other religions? Do you think there's things to learn or things to pick from? Do you think they serve a purpose? I mean, obviously, your opinion versus mine or someone else's will be all very different, right? Because a Christian would say, well, this is the way, right? Mm-hmm. As Jesus would say, this is the way. It's got to be this way. It can't go this way, right? Don't be swayed by other, you know what I mean? But have you ever thought about that, even as a Christian, where you're like, is there value to some of these other things or something I can pick from or something I can learn?
I had to address that when, you know, I was undergoing, you know, I was in college and still asking a lot of questions. You know, I'd walk by a desk where some religious group would have all their literature, and most people were running by.
Right.
I'd stop. I'd pick something up. I'd ask questions. So I had to do that investigation. Now, the reality is I believe that Jehovah's Witnesses teach what's in the Bible.
Right.
And I say that with respect to other religions that say that, you know, Jehovah's Witnesses don't teach that. We teach it.
Right.
And so there's got to be a mutual respect.
Sure.
But I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
Well, that's a tough question, probably. I mean, it's a question that I think will be, unfortunately, right? Unfortunately, I'm not sure, but it's a question that's going to keep getting asked for a long, long time, right? Because when people are in their camp and they're very like, this is the camp, and then now we got opposing people coming together, right? They're going to say, well, you need to be in my camp, and then they're going to try to pull you from yours into theirs, right?
And it sounds very elitist to say, I believe my religion is the true religion.
Right.
I do believe that. Of course. And again, if you're another religion, I hope you believe that too.
Right.
Otherwise, you're wasting your time.
Right.
I say that with respect. Everybody has the choice to how they're going to live their life.
Sure.
Are they going to base it on the Bible? Are they going to base it on something else? Are they going to what's going to drive their decisions and their morals. That's what free will is all about.
Sure.
I can't make somebody else do what I think is right.
Right.
That's one of the biggest issues in the Bible is free will.
Yeah.
Choosing to serve God or not.
That's a big one, I think, because people still to this day debate free will or not free will into very in-depth debates. I've watched a lot of those, and it's I think there's some good points on both sides many times when I listen to those things where, boy, it's tough because, there's times where I think I've made a free will choice, and there's other times where maybe I feel like it was a predestined thing, right? A lot of people do talk about, boy, it was always predestined for this to happen to me. Right. So like in my life, right, in my case, the multiple sclerosis, I feel that was a predestined set of events in order to generate my life into the direction of trying to heal others by being sick myself. Right. So in that case, you say, well, then do I have free will if I really truly believe in my core that was a predetermined event? Or does that even, that's when you can go real deep because you're like, well, does that even conflict with free will or not? Because maybe me and God came together before I came, and maybe we made a plan together and we said, look, God's like, I think you should be a great healer, and here's what I'm thinking you should do. I think you should get really sick, and I think you should recover and then teach others how to do so. And I said, that's a great idea.
So, but there's a thought, there's a scripture that says that God cannot be tried by evil things, nor does he try others. So a lot of people think, well, God's testing me.
Right.
God's not testing you. I mean, a lot of what we're suffering is because of inherited sin, imperfection.
Sure.
It's also other people's free will.
Sure.
Someone gets in a car and drives drunk and they hit you.
Correct.
God didn't do that to you.
Right.
Some stupid person that drove drunk.
Right.
The fact that you took a bad situation and turned it into helping others, that's a great thing. I don't believe that God did that to you.
Right. Where do you fall on? Because in situations like that, a lot of people, right, say, well, a lot of people's perspective of God is very varied. Some people say, well, this is a loving only God. Some people say, what's the word I'm looking for? All powerful, loving, but yet, not punishing is the right word I'm looking for. But you see what I'm saying? Like
just
the fear of God is a big statement, right? Or
four qualities of God are love, power, wisdom, and justice. And he combines them perfectly. So justice might be, when he executes judgment.
Right.
He has the right to do that.
Sure.
But he combines those things perfectly with love. And, they're four of his cardinal attributes, not the only ones, but he balances those things perfectly.
Well, and I think, so here's been obviously one of the number one, I think, pushbacks on Christianity from regular folk who maybe are thinking about it, maybe not. And this is even a debate within Christians, you know what I mean? Because I've been to church and I've done things. Once that was part of my investigation, going to church, attending church, talking to church goers, talking to priests. That was part of my investigations, right? A big one is the big hell debate, right? Is there a hell? Is it literal? Is it, is it more figurative? Is it, you know what I mean? The Hindus have a hell, right? So then, someone, say, for example, myself, right? If I'm trying to pick a camp and I'm listening to everybody in their camp and the Hindus are like, well, we got a hell. And if you don't go with us, you're going to ours. Christians are like, and if you don't go to ours, you're going to our hell. And you're like, well, shit, what do I do? Because I can't even hedge my bets.
So I'm going to come at that with two angles that we already touched on.
Yeah, sure.
Justice. And is the Bible from God? If so, what does it say?
Right.
So does it make sense? When the Bible says we were created in God's image, it means
Sure.
we're able to reflect to a degree love, power, wisdom, justice.
Right.
Does it make sense that a baby is born and if it doesn't get baptized and dies, it gets burnt in hell forever?
I know. I never thought that made sense.
It doesn't make sense. And it
Right.
doesn't make sense as far as a God who is love.
Right.
So when you look at the Bible, it does not teach hellfire.
Right.
In fact, are you familiar with the account of Job when he was suffering?
No, teach me more about that one.
This is for people who are looking into the Bible or
Right.
looking into these issues, they should read the first two chapters of the book of Job. This is actually a conversation that begins between God
Right.
and Satan.
Sure.
And God asked Satan, are you looking at Job? Are you, what do you think about him?
Right.
And Satan basically says, well, he just worships you because you bless him.
Right.
Take away everything and see if he doesn't curse you to your very face. Now, here's where the issue, the scripture I quoted earlier about God does not try other people with evil things.
Sure.
God doesn't do it. And Satan wants him to do it. He says, you do this to him. And he says, there he is in your hands. But don't touch him.
Right.
Satan goes down, kills all his children,
Right.
takes away his wealth, which is his flocks.
Sure.
And just does all these terrible things to Job.
Right.
So then they come back in chapter 2. God says to him, so what's Job doing? And he says, he's like a lunatic, skin on behalf of skin. Let me touch him. He says, all right, you can touch him, but don't kill him. So Satan strikes him with this cancerous boil from head to toe. He's sitting in ashes, scraping his cancerous wounds with pottery. But what it comes down to is, and then Satan, some of his other tactics are he brings people who are supposedly his friends, and they start accusing him.
Sure.
So now there's the mental attack. You're only suffering because you've done something wrong.
Right.
And so here's where I was driving at. Later in the book, chapter 14, Job prays that God would let him go to Sheol and remember him in a future time. Sheol is interpreted hell.
Right.
So was he praying? Was he suffering so much that he prayed, "Please, suffer, put me in hell and torture me more"?
Right. Right.
He was praying for relief. He was praying for death.
Right.
And so he's like, and the Bible teaches the resurrection. So people might, just hearing this, might say, well, what about all Job's children? The Bible promises God will resurrect us, right?
Right.
That's the hope. Not going to heaven.
Right.
It's death and then a resurrection. So Job's praying, please, just hide me in Sheol and remember me in a future time.
Right.
So the Bible does not teach a hellfire in that, God tortures people forever. It's just not taught. It's not in agreement with love or justice or his power or his wisdom.
Sure.
It's just not something that, would a parent has a child who does something wrong.
Right.
What would you think of a parent who took, the kid does something wrong, no matter how trivial.
Sure.
And the parent takes the child's hand and puts it on the stove.
Right.
I'm going to hold this here for a while.
Right.
I mean, that parent is a child abuser.
Right.
That child would be taken away. Why would people think a loving God would put someone in hell and let them be tormented forever?
Well, that's a biggest question, right? And that's,
Well, it's not an accurate teaching.
well, of course. Well, and that's like a big, obviously that is a huge factor in many people rejecting these things. You know what I mean?
And it makes sense. I mean,
including myself for my life.
if you have a sense of justice,
Sure.
well, that's just wrong.
You hear something like
And
that.
if that's the way God is, well, I'm not interested in learning about him.
Well, and it's an interesting, statement because, I remember a particular interaction with a other student that I was going to school with during my doctorate in chiropractic college, right? And he was very devout Christian, his whole family was. And we were on a road trip up to a seminar. And I remember we started to have, because he was really trying hard to bring a lot of us over to Christianity, right? Because at least those of us who weren't. And we started having a conversation, and I probed him with that very example, right, of the baby not being baptized, right? And I went even more extreme. I said, look, let's go even more extreme, right? Because obviously, for example, missionaries. The job of a missionary is to spread the word of Christ to others in order to save them many times from going to hell, because that's the whole job, right? According to their belief system, right? So I posed him with that question. I said, look, man, what about I want this hypothetical. We have the most remote village in the world that's been untouched by modern humanity, right? Christians can't even get there, right? And those still exist on a very small scale, right? And I said, are they all going to hell because, that they weren't exposed to Christianity? They don't even know that this is a thing. They didn't convert before death, didn't get baptized, right? Are they going to burn in hell even though they have no idea that Christ even exists? And he was like, yeah. And I said, that makes no sense. I said, look, man, you're never going to convert a single soul if that's the type of stuff you're talking about, because that makes no sense. Because like you said, a just God, a loving God, even a person with half a brain, half a dome. That's the part that I think has always bugged me when people do that strategy of trying to convert people, is like, look, if you don't do it, enjoy burning in hell. Right. How is that an effective recruitment method? You know what I'm saying? I never enjoyed that.
When the Bible talks about fear of God, it's not that kind of fear. It's not, oh God, I'm afraid I'm going to be tortured and burned forever.
By you in particular, right?
No.
Yeah.
It's a healthy fear based on love. Like a child fears displeasing his parent.
Right.
It's a positive thing.
Sure.
Not, geez, don't inflict pain on me.
Right. And that's a big one, I think, that a lot of people have been told many times. You know what I mean?
And that's not free will.
Sure.
What God wants is people to choose to serve him.
Right.
Their own free will. He wants that, but he doesn't make them do it.
Right.
And, a hellfire, would that not be coercion?
Right.
You better do it or you're going to suffer.
And that is the big debate, right? That a lot of people have in religious debates, but in general, right? I mean, I even connect that to stuff these days, right? Like governmental stuff where they're like, look, you better, you know what I mean? Like,
Sure.
Hey, if you want to quit your job, getting the jab, for example, right? Well, if you get the jab, you can keep your job. If you don't, we can't keep you on board because you're a selfish whatever.
They're motivating out of fear.
And then they go out and they say, well, we gave them the option. I mean, it's not our fault. I mean, they made the choice, but you didn't give them a choice. You said comply or go broke, right?
Comply or suffer.
Comply or suffer, right? That's one of the biggest debates of all time, I think, in religion versus people who aren't religious and things like that. And I think there's now a new generation, and I feel like I'm probably part of that generation that wants to take a lot of the wonderful things from all of these things and really learn from everybody. I feel like there's a lot of value in learning a lot of things from a lot of people. And in my own research of religion, for example, I find that there's a lot of commonalities in the structures around how people are supposed to be, right? So like the golden rule, I had a whole episode on the golden rule because every religion has every single one. Yep. I couldn't find a single religion that doesn't have a version of the golden rule. It is the exact same statement.
Yep.
From Jesus to Buddha to Shiva to all of them have that same golden rule. And I think that's a valuable thing.
How different would the world be if everybody applied the golden rule?
Right. And the problem is these days there is a strange sect of people that I think are finding religion valueless. That there's no value to it at all, and they're almost on a crusade to get rid of all religions.
Well, I don't agree with that,
of course,
but I understand it.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the world wars,
right,
ministers on both sides are saying, go kill the enemy.
Correct.
So Catholics were killing Catholics.
Right.
Protestants.
Right.
God is on our side.
People have been getting blessed before battle for thousands of years.
God is on our side. God
Correct.
is on our side.
Yeah.
So when you look at that, if you don't have a belief system,
right,
that just doesn't make sense. What kind of God is this? Is he got some sort of mental problem where he's he doesn't know how to make.
He chose favorites is a lot.
Well, or he's on both sides, so both sides are killing each other. It just doesn't make sense that you would preach people to kill others.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's been a big thing, right? Because I think the people who are attacking religion with certain parts of their arguments, I think are valid,
Sure.
right? Like
absolutely
a lot of people bring up the Crusades and things like that. It's a valid argument. A lot of people died for no reason.
Now, I will say this: a lot of people take that position because they just don't want to believe in God.
Right.
What it comes down to is, are you willing to live your life by what God tells you to?
Sure.
Which, in my case, I believe that's spelled out in the Bible.
Right.
So are you willing to live your life by this book? Are you willing to make changes?
Sure.
And some people just don't want to listen to anybody.
Right.
They're going to make their own rules. So
sure.
If a religion says this is how you should live, well, look at what religion does.
Sure.
Why should I listen to, your religion when it does these terrible things?
Sure.
And there's plenty of things they could pick on. Molestation in churches.
Sure.
You have the coaching people into war.
Sure.
A lot of hypocrisy.
Right. Financial gain is a big one.
Financial gain. There was a while back when a lot of these preachers were exposed.
Sure.
How they're getting little old ladies to send them all of their money.
Absolutely.
And they're living these lavish lives.
Absolutely. I mean, and unfortunately, we still have some of that going on today. You know what I mean? Now, I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but there's the Joel Osteens and those that are pretty suspicious because, boy, he's got a really nice mansion. His son's got really nice stuff for, you know what I mean? And obviously, they'll quote things in the Bible that talk about abundance and how there's no problem with abundance. Or they always, what's that sentence they always use? Sow the seed of something. There's a specific quote they try to use. Is sowing the seeds of something, or
the religious leaders that do that.
Right.
I mean, it's clearly, not what was taught.
No.
Jesus didn't teach.
Sure.
You know,
I always go back to the flipping of the table. I mean, the guy, Jesus flips over a table when there's money being
he was
exchanged.
upset that they were in the temple making money.
Right, sure.
And not only were they making money, but they were extorting money. See, people
That's
would
it.
come to the temple from, all over the world
Sure.
to worship. And then, they'd have to buy a sacrifice. And
Right.
so they'd charge them exorbitant sums.
Oh, sure.
And then they would go take that to the priest, who would have to say it's okay. And he'd say, nope, that's rejected. And they'd have to go back and do it again.
Right.
So they're taking advantage of people.
Well, and that's the sad thing, because the honest truth is, right, because when you come to planet Earth, you completely forget everything before, right? You have no memory of where you came from, the spark that you were, right? The energy signature, the piece of God that you are, or whatever, the little speckle that's been sent down, right, to a place like this. You don't remember any of that. So obviously you come here without a certain set of knowledge. And so you're trying to gain knowledge. And many times, like you said, the family unit will teach you whatever they believe, and either you accept that or you start pushing back, right? So my case, I did a big pushback. Some don't, right? Some continue on that pathway. Some take some of those things that they like and continue on, right? I mean, I think as time is going on, I think there's an interesting conundrum that's happening, right? Because once again, with the newer generations, I think they're the least probably religious newest generation to ever exist in quite some time on planet Earth. Bar none, obviously, before the major religions were established. So, I guess one of the questions I've had really is, as modern times are going on, and I think we can suspect that trend is probably going to continue, because those kids are going to have kids, and it's going to be even further down that line. Where do you see this all going, right? Because obviously a Christian says, well, at some point revelations is going to occur, right? That's what Christians' perspective. Revelations are coming at some point.
And I believe that.
We may not know the exact date, right? No. But that's the Christian's belief, right? So do you feel... in terms of your belief system, when you see this happening, right, where do you feel religions are going to play a role in trying to help guide these people out of some of the directions that they're going? Because obviously it's a whole new generation. They are very set in their ways, as are older generations, right?
As Jehovah's Witnesses, we do go out and talk to people. We do go door to door.
Right.
Because we do want to help people.
Sure.
And we do believe there is a point in time when God is going to step into earth's affairs and make things right.
Right.
And, the Lord's Prayer teaches people to pray for God's kingdom to come and his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that's what Revelation is talking about. And if you look, if you study Revelation, which it's very difficult because a lot of it's in signs. And,
Sure.
But it's talking about a time when God's going to bring in an end to sickness, death, and suffering, bring an end to wars. So if you go back to Genesis, when Adam and Eve and Satan, and they basically rebelled against God, introducing sin into the human family and imperfection and death, did God ever change his purposes from the beginning? Because a lot of people don't address this.
Right.
God said, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth." So that was his intention for a human family to populate the earth and enjoy God's creation.
Sure.
This is where we were meant to be. This is not a proving ground that we die and go somewhere else later. And so when that rebellion was introduced, did Satan defeat God's purpose? No. That's why Jesus said, pray for God's kingdom to come and his will be done on earth, just like it was said back then.
Right.
So there was a rebellion, and, it's not hard to see. But so basically God said, all right, we'll give it some time, and let's see what mankind live in their own way.
Right.
Unfortunately, with the influence of Satan, let's see what kind of earth you can develop.
Right.
Look at the earth. This is Satan's answer to Jehovah's rulership.
Sure.
It's terrible. There's so much human suffering and problems on the earth. And, when you look at it, you take any problem, war, sickness, a pandemic,
right.
You could go on and on. God can fix them, and he's going to.
Yeah. When?
Nobody knows.
Right.
Do I believe it soon? I do.
Right.
Look at the state of the affairs of the earth.
Sure.
So, nothing's changed as far as what God intended for the earth.
Right.
There was just an interruption, a rebellion, and he says, okay, it's kind of like a parent, again, who has a rebellious kid. don't do that.
Right.
You'll be sorry. No, I'm going to do it. Well, sometimes a parent will let the kid go along and find out, you know what, maybe I should have listened to mom and dad.
Make some mistakes. Sure.
Yeah, this hasn't worked out. They were right.
Sure.
And so that's what we're seeing is basically just free will playing out. And we see what the end result is for the earth. It's not good.
Do you think, because here's the thing, right? Because obviously I try to live life as best as I can and follow a lot of the principles that are placed. And I think there's a lot of value in Judeo-Christian original values, right? That set a very good moral structure for for people in general, right? Now, obviously the hell thing's a big debate, right? We talked a little bit about it, but a big one I think a lot of people bring up is, do you think people go to a quote unquote hell per se? And once again, obviously this is one Christian's perspective, right? I could have 10 more Christians in here who are going to give me a different perspective.
Sure.
We can all admit that. I don't think anybody here is questioning that. But for example, like if someone like myself is doing the best that I can, right? I'm following, as many of Jesus's wonderful teachings, or Buddha's also wonderful, all the things that are good and that have similarities, right? I'm trying to do the right thing. I feel guilty when I did something bad. I try to make amends, right? I try not to worship money and things like that. And yes, of course, you have to make money, but it shouldn't be your number one priority in life. I try to self-develop and also think, okay, well, how can I be better, right? So if I live my whole life like that, a lot of Christians, for example, would say, well, you still are going to go to a burn. But once again, it goes back to what you and I have discussed. Would it really, if God made me and loves, built me like a lot of what I am and loves me unconditionally, right? Would he really send me to a place like that, fully doing my full service of what I can? I'm trying to help others, or I'm giving money to the homeless, or I'm volunteering, right? If I'm doing all the right things, would I still be punished if I'm not following Christianity, exactly Christianity in terms of saying I'm Christ follower?
Yeah. Again, the Bible does not teach that there's a hellfire that God tortures people in.
Right.
When it talks about hell, it's talking about the common grave of mankind. The issue is life or death. So, the wages sin pays, this is a scripture, the wages sin pays is death, the gift God gives is everlasting life. So the worst case scenario, if someone does not want to worship God, is they won't get everlasting life.
Sure.
But he's not going to torture people.
Right.
It's life or death.
Right.
And that's the issue. Now, do I believe that just trying to be a good person is enough? No. I believe that, we have to look to God. We have to find out what his standards are and do what he tells us to do. He has the right to tell us what to do. And again, you have to start with that basis. Is the Bible from God? Okay, so it is. I believe that. Okay, so what does it tell us?
Sure.
What's necessary? What's required? And it's up to each individual to do that research for themselves and decide.
Right. So what do you say, though, to someone like myself, right, where it's obvious, like let's say I read the full Bible to a perfection, right? I then read the Quran, right? Because obviously that's one arguably almost just as large as Christianity, if not larger. I haven't looked at the numbers lately. I'm sure they fluctuate, but top three, right, is the Quran, the Bible, right? And maybe Buddhism or something similar is probably number three, right? So these are probably the top three. So when you're someone like myself who's very open to all things, and I feel like there's value in all kinds of things, and I obviously believe God exists, you know what I mean? We're talking about it. I believe there's a higher power, which is why I try to do a lot of these things. Mm-hmm. Not because I'm trying to buy my way into something, which I think unfortunately is a lot of the ways people go for religion, right? They say, well, I'm going to hedge my bets, and you know what I mean? I might as well believe in this to hedge my bet in case I'm wrong, or things like that, or in order to avoid a bad place, or, et cetera, et cetera. But for someone like myself, right, when I look at all these things objectively, and you know what I mean, it's in my deeper consciousness, and this is once again just a personal thing. This isn't me trying to convert anybody to my belief system. I'm just a truth seeker. I'm always trying to seek truth. Because of the way my brain works, when I read the Bible and I read these things, for me personally, there's not enough in there to convince me to fully convert into one thing, right? Once again, I'm not trying to hedge my bets. I always knew that I would never want to believe something because I'm trying to hedge a bet, right? I need to be full, like you said, I want to be fully into the belief system that I'm in, not because I'm trying to gamble around a little bit and put a couple chips here and put a couple chips there and pray one of these chips sticks, right? Which a lot of people do. They're like, well, let me put my chips in here, and I'm like, I hope one of these hits. You know, it's kind of like an investment strategy. I make a portfolio and I'm like 30% in Christianity over here. I might put 30% in the Buddhism, right? I'm just praying to God, one of these is correct.
One of them pays out.
I'm hoping the odds are good, right? Instead of just saying, well, I believe in none of them or whatever, right? Like some people do, right? That's obviously atheism, right? I said, well, I'm none of them. But in terms of someone like me, right, I believe God exists, and I believe that, you know, like you said, God is love and is just, and things, and bad things happen as we perceive them to be bad, right, because of multiple reasons. And in my beliefs, where I've built it and the way I've perceived the world is bad things, quote unquote, can happen because, for example, like you said, free will is here. So I could be walking down the street having a wonderful life, and even though I might have a wonderful plan from God for the rest of my life, like you said, drunk driver might come in or someone's texting on their phone. I'm like, yeah, I'm having a great day, and boom, I'm done right there. Mm-hmm. You know, that's free will, right? But, you know, someone like me, right, might say, well, there's certain things that are generated by God or something like that. Like a hurricane would be generated by God because God would be in control of these things. But it's hard to say, right? Because someone like me says, well, why would God wipe out that village? I don't know. It's above my pay grade. Did God even do that?
Right.
You know, is God the type of God that's a chess player and is constantly moving these pieces? Or did God already set it all in motion and is now as an observer? That's a big debate.
Well,
between
remember
people.
that God does not try people with evil things.
Right.
So, you know, a hurricane, if you look at in the Bible, when God acts,
Sure.
there are several things that are necessary. Number one, he gives a warning.
Sure.
Number two, he tells you the way out.
Sure.
And number three, he does not destroy the innocent with
Sure.
the guilty. So a hurricane comes in and just, you know, wipes out a town and people.
Sure.
That's indiscriminate. There's really no warning.
Right.
You know, there's no broadcasted way to avoid it. And innocent, you know, good people die and bad people die.
Right.
It's just an act. It's nature.
Right. So would you say that God's obviously not constantly micromanaging our lives in that way, right? Like a lot of people say God is micromanaging. I mean, there's the different debates, right? Some people are like, he's the chess player and he puts every piece where he wants it to go, irregardless of what we perceive as good or bad.
No,
right?
that's not free will.
Sure.
You know, and you know, I commend you
Right.
for trying to be a good person.
Right.
The world would be different if everybody tried that. You know, the reality is most of us know what's right and wrong.
Right. On a base level, right?
Right.
Sure.
It's wrong to steal.
Of course. Right.
It's wrong to lie.
Sure.
Cheat. It's wrong to murder. I mean, we all know basic rights and wrongs.
Right.
But some people, you know, want to justify, well, you know, I did it because.
That's a big one, right?
You know, and they're trying to excuse their own actions in their own mind.
To feel better about what they did. Like the contractors that screwed me recently on my stuff, right? He said, well, I was busy in other jobs and this and that. You're justifying a wrong you did.
Right.
And you're trying to make yourself sleep better at night saying, well, I have a family to provide for, so it's okay if I screw over this guy a little bit in order to feed my family and things like that. And I've always been of the belief system, look, man, if we're all going to starve, you know what I mean? We should all starve together in some way because you can't ever justify, well, I'm going to take you know what I mean? I'm going to take this little bit of food because I'm a little more valuable than this other human, right? Because God made us all equal in this case, right? Now, there's obviously a lot of these days, right? You know, and I touched on this recently. There's a lot of, I think there's a lot of moral debates recently, especially like, for example, right, the Roe v. Wade big thing, right? That was huge in terms of morality questions.
Yep.
Because, and debate's been going on since the moment abortion and then things like that started happening, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to dig too deep into it, but it's moments like that that then highlight a gigantic gap in where do people feel morality lies. You know what I mean? Because there are those, for example, the religious people who are like, look, there's no reason for that unless it's going to kill the mother is their thing. And then some people are like, there's no ever, even if it risks the mother's life, there's no reason ever. Then you got people on a certain aisle in that case, just in this one specific case, Ray says, well, it's moral all the way up till this month or this time frame or this thing. And a lot of that really is recently highlighting where can morality's spectrum fall for people based on their different belief systems. You know what I mean? And even within religions, an example too, like one Christian might say, well, it's okay, it's still up to this point, right? You got people who are like, well, they say they're a Catholic, but then they're like, well, abortion's good. And a lot of Catholics who are hardcore Catholics would say, that's a big no-no. Right. You can't, I mean, come on, right? And then the Pope comes out and says, hey man, you know, so obviously the Pope then kind of gets outside of his own religion, right? And there's,
So I can tell you again, looking at the Bible and the scriptures,
Sure.
there's an account where a law was given to the Jews where it said if two men get in a fight
Right.
and they bump into a pregnant woman,
Right.
and if she were to abort that baby,
Right.
they were put to death.
Sure.
Now, so it was a serious thing. So
Right.
how much more would God feel about someone doing it on purpose?
Right.
Now, I apply that to myself. Jehovah's Witnesses do not get involved in the politics. We don't try to force other people to believe. what we
Right.
believe. We don't try to, force our beliefs through legislation.
Right.
And that falls into the arena of, we're not trying to control you.
Sure.
And we're not trying to legislate you. I'll tell you what I believe, apply it to myself, and
That's it.
That's it.
Kind of like the Amish, right? The Amish have their belief. They're like, look, they're not trying to convert you to Amish. They're just like, look, we're here.
Well, a lot of things have been politicized. So, I mean,
Sure.
you could take abortion, but there's a lot of other things that, religious people get involved in.
Well, the moral debates are big, right? I mean, a big moral debate for me, and we talked a little bit about it, but we didn't go too deep on it, right? Is there a time where killing someone's justified, right? Is it or isn't it, right? If someone's breaking into my house and I need to defend my family, am I within my rights morally? I mean, legally, sure. Kind of now it's changing. It used to be like a guarantee, right? If someone breaks in my house, I could shoot them, right? And defend my family. Not nowadays, you might do that. You might go to jail, even though you might have saved your family from getting murdered, right? Mm-hmm. But in terms of morality, that's a big one, right? Because, for example, for someone who like me as a lay person who's done some reading on the Bible and things like that, but could have gone more in depth than I have, right? The 10 Commandments, right? Don't kill, right? So thou shalt not kill, right? Now, in this situation, now we're hitting a hard point because I don't want to kill someone like that, for example, who's coming in my house. But if I don't, he's going to kill my entire family. I'm put in a very tough spot because is that just to let him kill all of us just so that I avoid breaking a rule like that? I mean, where do you fall on stuff like that where it's a hard thing for someone?
You have to look
like
at,
us?
like when you look at something like that, self-defense, it's not like there's a chapter in the Bible that says, here's
correct.
Here's what we say on the self-defense. But you can look at different scriptures and when they touch on it. And there were accounts where if someone broke into your house and, it had to do if you could identify who it was. Now, this was within the ancient law to Israel.
Sure.
So theoretically, everybody was a worshiper of God.
Right.
But here someone breaks into your house. And if you defended yourself, you couldn't see them and that person ended up dead. You did not have to pay a price for that.
Right.
If you murdered somebody, you could be liable for your life. So there's degrees of things.
Right.
Can you defend yourself? Again, I would direct you to scriptures. I don't want to start. I don't want to start giving you what I think about.
No,
it.
sure. But it's a hard question. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but there's some common sense to it.
Right. There is, but the problem is, since people are being people, right? If I pull another Christian and he's going to say totally justified, I could pull another one. He's going to say not justified at all. Got to let him murder.
See, that's
everybody.
where, part of the issue of free will is we all have to make those decisions for ourselves.
Right.
And, since I consider the Bible as God's guidebook for us,
right.
I look at that.
Sure.
And I read and I see, and make my own decisions. And even of the people who do that, you might find some different feelings or, different opinions.
And I think that's the tough part for someone like me, right? Because if 10 of us read the same passage, we might get 10 different versions of what we felt was the intent of that passage, right? Like even the times that I went to church and, they would read a passage, I'm listening to different people's interpretations of it, almost like, because people have Bible studies, right? And people talk about, well, here's what I felt, or here's what, almost like when we read the same novel, we might have 10 different opinions from the same. I read Frankenstein and I might say, look, that was just a scary story. You read Frankenstein, obviously this is a book about loneliness and being a pariah and being outside of the, scope. So I think that's where someone like myself has had a hard time believing the Bible and things like that. Once again, not taking value out of these things, right? I could read the Bible and read a beautiful passage about morality and things and be totally inspired to follow, certain sections of those things, right? But the hard part for someone like me is when 10 of us can read the same passage and have different interpretations, it's hard for me to believe that is the full word of God when we have different interpretations of that thing. You know what I'm saying?
There are do's and don'ts.
Right.
There are things that are, God condemns and things that he doesn't.
Sure.
But then there's also, I guess you would call it a gray area. And that's
Right.
where conscience comes in.
Right.
And God expects us to do our best to reflect his feelings on the matter.
Sure.
And you might have different people that have different, if it's not spelled out black and white, there might be,
Right.
what might be wrong for you might not be right for me, and
Sure.
vice versa. But if we all take the time to study what God's telling us, we'll be serving him in a way that's acceptable to him.
Right. Well,
Not everything is spelled out black and white.
well, of course, but like when someone has a pushback, right, and says, well, the Bible, now this is off of what I know, and I'm not a Bible expert. I just know what I've looked into, right, to a certain degree, right, where the Bible is basically a compilation of different writings from different authors of their experiences with Jesus or their experience, right, and obviously the Jews had accumulated their knowledge, right, over time, but once again, we as humans still had to put it together. A lot of people like myself feel that there have been certain times in history where there was many opportunities for people, because we have free will, to change or manipulate certain sections of the Bible. I don't remember the year date, but when they put the Bible together, I'm not a perfect historian, right? But when they put that together and it was given to these religious leaders to then accumulate all of this and to decide how it was going to be put together, people like myself are quite worried that because they were in a position of power and would like to maintain that power, they very could have and likely possibly did change certain aspects to maintain their power. So how do you feel about that situation? Because obviously that's the biggest pushback.
Sure. So when looking at the Bible for myself to determine, is it from God? It was written over 1,600 years.
Sure.
Over 40 different authors.
Right.
But they really weren't the authors. They were more like a secretary. They were like you talking to people
They're
up front,
recounting a story.
saying, okay, this is what I want you to do. So if you believe, the Bible says that it's inspired of God. Mm-hmm. So if you believe that he was directing its writing, it'd be very easy for him to use 40 different secretaries. And when you look at it, it's very, the theme of the Bible is, God's kingdom and the sanctification of God's name is throughout all the Bible books, 66 Bible books, over 40 men. There's no way that could happen if it wasn't directed by God. I mean, play a little game of Whisper Down the Lane. You could get 5 people, and they start with the first person says something, and when it comes out the other end, you can't even recognize it.
Sure.
The Bible is consistent through over 40 different men who
Right.
used to pen it, and 1,600 years. So, I mean, that's a proof. And we have original manuscripts dating back to almost to the time when it was written. Mm-hmm. So when people do take liberties,
right,
we can identify it and correct it.
So do you think, because here's been a big question of mine, do you think that Jesus, for example, wanted a religion to even be established? Do you think Jesus wanted to be worshipped, or do you feel that he wanted to have these things written down just so that he could change the course of mankind without religion, but just to have principles for people to follow and develop to be better? That's a big one, right? Because in my head, I'm like, I don't know if Jesus would have wanted to be worshipped or to create a religion, because he would have known that it would have created a lot of the corruption that you and I have talked about. That's, inevitable in people, right? Inevitably, there's going to be somebody out there who's going to see something as powerful as this and say, God, this is a great opportunity, right? Because it's still happening in 2022. Sure. This thing's old as hell, and it's the same game. People are still, from time to time, reading that and seeing how people react and saying, my God, I could take this and I could be something. I could be a millionaire, and I can have all this power, and I can do it. I mean, it's the same repeating structure.
Sure.
So do you think that Jesus wanted to be worshipped as a God or as God? Because
no, he was the Son of God, and
Right.
always directed worship to his Father.
Right.
In fact, I touched on the Lord's Prayer earlier.
Sure.
He taught people to pray, Our Father. That includes his.
Right.
Our Father in heaven.
Right.
So he was directing worship to his Father. Now, we do pray in Jesus' name because he paid the sacrifice for us, a ransom
Sure.
sacrifice for our sins. Now, I just want to touch on that before I move on.
Oh, yeah.
People don't understand what that sacrifice means. You have a lot of people say, believe in Jesus, your sins are forgiven. Why?
Right.
If you look back at Adam and Eve,
Right.
Adam, the first man, threw away what God had given him. He sinned against God. And a ransom that Jesus gave is basically paying the price for what Adam threw away. So you had to perfect man Adam and a perfect man Jesus.
Sure.
Jesus is called the last Adam. So when he gave his life sinless, the wage of sin pays is death. So when he died for us, that's not a price he had to pay. You follow? Mm-hmm. So he was basically given a ransom for what Adam threw away.
Right.
So it's a legal basis for God to forgive us for being sinners.
Sure.
Is it our fault we're sinners? Well, no.
Right.
We weren't born perfect. We were born imperfect. Why?
Right.
Because of what Adam did.
Sure.
So Jesus laid the basis for us to have the ability to have a clean conscience based on forgiveness of our sins, and two, to have the opportunity for everlasting life. Now, was Jesus wanting people to worship him? No.
Right.
No.
That's what's intriguing to me, because that's like the main tenet that many people see in Christianity, right? Because when I go to church, I could make a pretty good bet. I could probably put all my savings on that I'm going to see a giant cross with Jesus on it at the altar in probably every church I'll ever go to that's a Christian church. Mm-hmm. I don't think you'll ever not see that, right? Mm-hmm. So obviously it's a big worship of Jesus, and I've heard many times from many Christians, well, Jesus was God directly. And that never made sense to me, because I'm like, well, then why would he be called a son if it's God directly?
He's the son of God, not God.
Right. Sure.
And if he died for our sins, can God die?
Right.
No.
Sure.
Not an almighty God.
Sure.
So he was the son of God.
Right.
He paid the ransom for us.
Sure.
Now, the Bible says he was resurrected a spirit, so he was brought back to life. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of witnesses to that. Mm-hmm. And then he ascended into the heaven. So he's a spirit creature. He cannot come back and take his physical body again. He gave that up as a sacrifice.
Sure.
To pay that ransom.
Sure.
One perfect man, another perfect man. One threw it away, he gave it. So God has a legal basis to forgive us. That's why, that's why God can forgive us. It's not just a couple of words. Say you believe in Jesus and you're forgiven.
Right.
It's a legal provision.
Right.
God can't just forgive someone if they sin. They have to truly be sorry and take advantage of the ransom.
Right.
But he's not going to forgive people who aren't sorry.
Right.
But he gave the provision. He made the provision.
So, when we're digging into stuff like that, then, because obviously then Jesus would be, if people take these things literally, being, Jesus being the actual Son of God and things like that. And once again, I'm just as an observer here, and I'm just a questioner. Do you think anywhere, now once again, this is your personal, because obviously I don't think this would anywhere be, I would not think anywhere included in the Jehovah's Witness specific perspective, but do you think there's any possibility that God seeded multiple religions for any reason? Do you think that God gave actual right? Because Buddha in Asia, right? Buddha was their prophet who felt that God was giving him things, right? Shiva and others, or Muhammad in other parts of the world, right? Regardless of what the different debates about these things, right? Those people saw that they had seen miracles performed on the similar levels of Jesus in these other areas that we weren't obviously exposed to in our sections of the world, right? So do you feel anywhere deep down in there that there's a possibility that God seeded these different religions because of different cultures and different things to create value that way?
I don't, and I'll tell you why.
Sure.
We just talked about the ransom.
Sure.
That's the provision God has given us to have forgiveness of sins and worship him acceptably.
Sure.
That's Christianity.
Right.
And the Bible teaches us about that. These other books don't.
Sure.
So that's my personal belief. Again, I respect other religions who believe something else.
Right.
And I hope they believe it is the truth. Otherwise, I don't get why they would be doing it.
Sure.
But my personal belief is that's the route to serve God acceptably and to have his approval.
Right.
Through the ransom. And, again, I believe the Bible is from God. There's a lot of proof for that.
So in terms of other proof, right? So we gave a quote there for being around before round was a big thing. What would you say some of the other top things are that you felt were deeply proving that was the truth?
So there are some prophecies that are amazingly accurate.
Sure.
So God told what was going to happen in advance. A lot of them have to do with the Messiah.
Right.
There are certain prophecies in the book of Daniel that told us exactly when the Messiah would appear. Exactly.
Right.
And that's not a coincidence. It's accuracy. Now, you'd have to look at that and accept that the Bible's from God and look at the prophecy.
Well, that's the big thing, because I could say, well, if I pre-wrote it in, I could say, well, it's going to happen on December 3rd. I'm just picking a date, right? December 3rd, whatever. And then if I wrote that in there, you could then retroactively, when it happens, say, oh, or it could happen, and then you could retroactively write it back and say, oh my God, look at this, or you know what I mean? Because it's been so long for someone like myself, right? Thousands and thousands and thousands of years. At any given point, for someone with a logical brain like me, you could say, well, they might have adjusted the dates to match up perfectly, or you see where you follow me on where I'm going with that.
We can go back again to the original manuscripts and know what they say, but it's not just one thing.
Right.
Yeah, you have to look at it's like a fingerprint. Okay.
Sure.
So you have things like the Earth hanging on nothing. So scientifically, there are things that doctors are just finding out. The Bible talked about having a cheerful heart is good as a cure. Well, now people recognize that having a good mental outlook can help us physically. Then you have the prophecies when it touches on things like. What's the word? Geographical things and things that have to do with archaeological things. When you look at all of these different areas, whenever the Bible touches on them, they're accurate. And so you got a fingerprint that, yes, this is from God. So it's not just one thing. And again, you'd have to, maybe this is something we could talk about another time, but you'd have to look at all, there's not just one thing in any of these areas. There's a whole bunch of things that support the Bible's authenticity.
Sure.
Historically, archaeologically, scientifically, with prophecies, and so when you look at them all together, it's unmistakable proof. It's a fingerprint. There's no other way that this could have come to us except if God gave it to us.
So I mean, when we say now, once again, it's not my area of expertise, but a lot of times these days, right? There's many scientists who end up being atheists. Because of the science that they know. Because once again, I'm not an expert scientist. I know certain sciences in a very particular profession and set of things, right? So like the scientific knowledge that I hold is about how do I heal a body that's sick. That's where I hold. So whenever I'm talking about any subject that's outside of my subject, I always tell everybody, look, like take it with a grain of salt because I'm not a geologist. So if I start talking about geology, don't listen to me as the main expert on something like that, right? But in terms of some debates, right, where there's pushback on biblical events and things like that, for example, one of them would be the Great Flood. That's a big pushback by scientific community because they claim many times when I've watched scientific videos who break these things down, they say that they have enough proof where they showed that there was never a great flood across the entire earth. That the best argument you could make was certain sections.
Some of them say that.
Yes.
But there's others, there's proof that there was a flood.
Right.
I mean, you could go to the tallest mountains in the world and you find seashells on top of them.
Sure.
How'd that happen?
Sure.
And every major culture has always had a flood story.
Sure.
In fact, if you were to study the Chinese language, are you familiar with it at all? It's characters. There's like 8,000 characters. And you know what the characters are for a flood? 8 people in a boat.
Sure.
So it's things like that you just keep looking at it. It's, some people say there was never a flood, but there's evidence there was.
Right. Well, and I mean, in terms of, and like once again, I'm not trying to push back, but some people would say that there's evidence of a flood, but it would be in a specific region. So I've watched certain scientists debate some of these things, and once again, I can't get a direct quote because it's been quite some time since I've watched it. I'll go try to rewatch some of them. But for example, one of the arguments where they said that there would have been a flood, but it would not have been a great flood across the entire earth was they said that most of the proof of a great flood happened around the areas of Christianity's origins, right? Israel and then all that region, that there was great proof that there probably was a great flood in that specific region, but in other parts of the world, there wasn't that. But their argument was that maybe that to these people, that was a true thing because they wouldn't have known about the rest of the entire globe at that time period. For them, the world was their section, as it was for many things, right? Before we came to the United States, you know what I mean? It was a new world, even though it was already there. They didn't know about us. We didn't know about them. So for them, that was their whole world. For our immigration, that was our whole world until we came together and said, oh, wow, this is crazy, right? So once again, I'm not trying to poke holes in anything. I'm just trying to give you the perspectives of somebody when I hear or see that, and someone presents evidence right that, and then I've got someone else who says, well, that's crap, and I've got my evidence. Well, now I got a problem because now I don't have enough evidence from any single person to take me all the way. I think that's the crux of why people are struggling with these things to this day, because as science is progressing, now I would say I'm a combination of science and spiritualism and energy and things like that. I think there's a way where all that molds together wonderfully. I don't think they're in opposition. I think they come together, right? But not everybody feels that way. There's plenty of people who are like, well, I'm very, very scientific. And there's others who are like, look, I'm just pure religion and this is how it is, regardless of what the science may say, right? So, for example, like the creationism thing, right? There is no evolution. For me, I said, well, maybe why couldn't there be evolution? Couldn't God create an evolution if he wanted to? In someone like my perspective, I could see where those would come together. But obviously, as a Jehovah's Witness, I would imagine that would be a conundrum, right? Because you'd say, well, Adam and Eve, it started.
It's not a conundrum for me.
Right.
Because I've looked at creation in depth.
Sure.
And if you were to look into evolution, what you would find is, well, first of all, it's not scientific. The scientific method is you observe facts,
sure,
form a theory, test it, observe facts, revise it, and that's the scientific theory.
Sure.
You're always looking at facts. So Darwin starts with, I'm going to make up a story, and I'm going to anticipate the facts.
Okay.
So let's start one, unscientific. He also made many acknowledgments. Like he said that when the fossil record is explored, that you will find a gradual the further you go down, there'll be less and less life. And he acknowledged that if there's a burst of life in one level of the fossil record, that would be fatal to his theory.
Sure.
And that's what there is. There's at the Cambrian level or the fossil level, boom, all sorts of life. Below that, nothing. So he just basically made something up and said, this is what I think we're going to find. And he acknowledged other things, like to think that the eye could have evolved is he couldn't even imagine it. And so then you look at what's going on now in the scientific community with the theory of evolution.
Sure.
There's different camps arguing.
Right.
And some of them acknowledge that the odds of life forming with undirected chance, without a creator, is virtually zero. So some of them have taken their theories. They don't want to, they call it ID, intelligent design. They don't want to go there. Some of them do because there's no other explanation. But some of them have gone to outer space. Well,
sure.
maybe the parts for a cell floated down. It's just not scientific, and they're arguing among themselves. So
do you feel like, though, because obviously they've discovered a lot of versions of human-like, humanoids, I guess would be the best. Once again, I'm not an expert on it, so I can't only speak to whatever, but I only was taught, obviously, the basics of evolutionary theory. And then once again, a theory could still be changed if science is correct, right? You could update it. You could throw it away and find something better, right? I mean, they have in-between style of humans. Now, once again, I haven't found convincing evidence in anybody's camp in terms of, for me, where I would fully fall. I mean, in my own thought process as someone who's just really open. I'm very open to changing my mind if I'm presented with great evidence or reasons to change. Mm-hmm. And then once again, if I could find even greater evidence than that, I would change again, no problem for me. But in terms of, because I'm not attached to a specific set of beliefs, for me, I don't think they would be in incongruence. If God wanted there to be evolutionary, I think it wouldn't even be that challenging for God. God could say, look, I could make a spark right here and let it go. Why not? I mean, why couldn't he? And I say he, but I don't know if God would have a gender or not. Now, obviously, the Bible uses the word he exclusively, right? Mm-hmm. So people can take that for whatever they would like, right? Obviously, but in terms of me, that's where I'm listening to what everybody has to say, and I'm trying to find my own way with things, because if God is the way that God's described by many people, where it's like all-seeing, all-knowing, capable of anything, right? Yes, man has free will, all these things. God could easily create and have this go wherever he would want it to. If God wanted,
he could have used evolution in creation.
Right.
But that's not the question.
Sure.
The question is there a God who created us?
Oh, of course, and that's the big one, right? Because
so let's answer that question first. And
sure.
One of the things I looked at was, like, take humans. Mm-hmm. You got a man and a woman.
Sure.
Okay. They get together, they create a baby. So if you go back in time to when there was the first man and the first woman made a baby, let's say it's Adam and Eve.
Sure.
Before that, they couldn't. So you had something that looked almost like a man that could reproduce and almost like a woman that could reproduce. How did they get to that point?
Hard question. I don't know.
They couldn't. It's the chicken and egg. It's impossible. Because you would have had to have something that kind of looks like a woman evolving over years, putting together systems and, a reproductive system that could eventually produce a baby. How did it reproduce?
Well, once again, I'm not versed enough to be able to say exact evolutionary theory.
They don't even address it because there's no answer. There are a lot of chicken egg things that they just don't even address because the answer supports that we were created. That's and they don't want to go there.
Well, for me, it's tough because I read a lot. Anything I read in general, to me, I take with quite a heavy grain of salt because, science changes, people's opinion changes. Now, the thing is, the Bible hasn't changed since it was obviously written at a certain point. It's stayed relatively, obviously, the same with people's interpretations obviously varying, or the Quran's people's perspective on the Quran, or this, their perspectives are changing. But it's tough because for someone like me, right, it's hard to be convinced by any one camp because things can change, information can change. Everybody is very sure about what they believe. Well, and that's, I think, the tough part.
Let's say that we were aliens from another planet. We came to the Earth.
Right.
We didn't believe in creation or evolution.
Sure.
And we're going to look at everything living on the Earth. Every blade of grass, every amoeba, every person, every animal.
Sure.
Everything. Every fungus, mold. Where did they all come from? Mold came from mold. An animal came from an animal. A person came from a person. You have trillions and trillions of examples where life came from life. No examples of life spontaneously appearing on the planet and being able to reproduce. When you look at evolution, you go back to what the theory is that in the oceans, the first thing that formed was a single cell.
Sure.
Even that, there's problems. The odds are virtually say it's impossible. You can't have proteins without DNA, DNA without proteins. Even a cell is very, very complicated. It's got manufacturing centers. It's got transportation centers. It's got armies around the cell wall that let things in and let things out. So what they're saying is all the parts just happen to come together, which they can't prove. It's virtually impossible. But not only that, it's living.
Well, the tough part, I think, for people is...
Well, hold on. There's one more step.
Sure.
Not only is it living, but it's got the blueprints to reproduce and form another living thing.
Well, sure.
And it's impossible.
I think the part is hard for people because for me, right, even if it would be unlikely to happen, for me, there would still be a chance for potentially something like that to happen. Potentially, right? But once again, I don't understand things enough, right? But there are, people who would arguably say that they're much more, obviously, way more in depth on that topic, right? They're Big Bang Theory people that are very adamant that they've got proof that the Big Bang is the beginning of our section of the universe and yada, 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 right? Because of the evidence that they're claiming they have of being able to now look back and still hear the riffs or whatever, right? So there's that, I can't remember where this was. I think it was somewhere in Europe. The guy invented that machine and he could actually hear still the sound waves of the original Big Bang or yada yada, and then they investigated and did all this stuff. Once again, way outside of my depth. That's not my forte nor my passion, right? But there's plenty of people out there who are way more versed in stuff like that would give a lot of pushback and say, well, I've got the evidence that evolutionary theory is the best theory we have. Now, that, once again, being the best theory that they have scientifically as observations of would the things begin. If we didn't have someone saying, well, this is how it began, right? They didn't have a Bible, right? If it was all wiped away and we had to pick up pieces and say, well, how did this thing get formed? Because that's also, to me, science ever is just a rediscovery of what's already here, right? If a caveman could have the design of how to create a cell phone, all of the stuff is already there if we had all the knowledge already discovered, right? Because everything's just a discovery,
Again,
see what
if
I'm
you
saying?
if you were looking to the conversations among evolutionists, some of them say that the only answer is intelligent design.
Sure.
If you have design, you have a designer.
Well, and some people would give
you know,
pushback on that.
well-
would you say, because it's like,
They push back because they don't want to believe it.
because they'll do like that watchmaker thing, right? If I'm on a beach and I see a watch and I have to assume there's a designer, because how else would the watch get here? Things like that. There's that whole debate I've heard before between people. I think they both make good points, right? But many people would argue just because something looks intricate does not mean that there's proof that it was designed, even though it may have many features of a design or may be very intricate. You follow me on that?
Well, design is proof of a creator, and you know you have to acknowledge that. Some of the evolutionists say, you know, if all the evidence points to a creator, we can't discount it because we don't want to believe it. I mean, if all the evidence points to, I mean, our bodies. You should know as a physician, our bodies are so complicated.
Oh, very intricate. Yep.
And the design, I mean, things happen inside of us we don't even know they happen, and it's by design. And to say that it wasn't by design is a huge. Actually, evolution is a what would you say? It's a religion. It's a faith. It's an undocumented faith.
Well, it's another
unproven
type.
faith.
It would be another type of I think of faith in a way, like you're saying. I mean, I think for sure you have to be. You mean you have to have the belief on what you've found thus far, because obviously they, at this point, wouldn't have discovered all of the in-between versions of a humanoid that you would need in order to fully prove that theory. You know, they only have a certain number of the in-betweens. They don't have enough where you could fully argue.
Well, that's what the whole
beginning to end.
Everybody has heard of the missing link.
Sure.
And that's what the problem is, because what they're saying is, as evolution moves forward, you get more and better
Towards this version.
Right.
Or a similar enough version. Right.
You know,
right.
the missing link is the one right next to us. You know, how come we have, you know, gorillas and apes over here, but the one that's closer to us, it doesn't exist? Because wouldn't that one be better? Wouldn't it have evolved closer to us? See, that's what the problem with the missing link is.
Well, and once again,
you could apply that not just to us,
sure.
all animals, all plants. Where's the missing link? There
Well,
is
and,
none.
and I'm obviously not, once again, the biggest expert, right? But I think a lot of people argue about the branches thing. I mean, I've watched in the past, it's been quite some time since I've brushed up on it, but the argument, obviously, for evolutionary theory with the branches and stuff, where a lot of people, you know, I've heard the argument that I do think is fallacious. Well, it's like, well, we got apes, you know, why are apes still here? Well, of course, you could have a branch, right, where one goes towards apes and one goes more towards humans, which would make sense.
Let's go back
right?
to the
But,
scientific theory.
you know, things like that. But
Are they observing facts for that? Or are they just grasping at straws to try to support a theory that's unproven?
well, they would argue, they would say, well, we've got enough versions of a humanoid ape that, you know, has so many more human characteristics than obviously a full ape line, right? They would argue, well, this was just two versions of the same thing, right? So if like the fish had a deeper origin to the fish, well, then there was multiple branches that created, say, this type of fish versus that type of fish versus this type of fish. And so and then once again, I can't speak for an evolutionist, but you know, or someone who scientifically proves these things.
If you would follow this on an ongoing basis, you would see a lot of the claims they make proven false. There was one, quote unquote, I think it was called Piltdown Man. It was a skull they discovered, and it was a fraud. And they touted this, here it is, it's the missing link. There was another animal called the coelacanth. It was a fish. They said it went extinct millions of years ago, and here's proof, because it didn't really have a spine, but, you know, next thing you know, they start catching them.
Right.
And the reason it didn't have, you know, the spine that you would expect is because it was a deep-dwelling fish.
Sure.
The pressure, a spine couldn't take the pressure.
Right.
And now they're catching them. So, no, it's not proof of evolution. So are they trying to support a theory, trying to find something to support a theory that hasn't been developed by observing facts? Or are they observing facts and then developing a theory based on that?
Sure. I mean, and I'm not, you know, as I say, as an observer, I don't know where I would fall in any of it, to be honest with you. I mean, and in my head, obviously, the question is, does it not matter for me? I don't know, because obviously I'm already, with the realities that I can test as best as I can test, I'm obviously in this reality, whatever, right? I mean, I go to bed, I'm going to wake up here tomorrow unless I die and wake up somewhere else, right? I mean, that's something we can observe enough to know that's a fact, right? I could hit this, and to my best of my ability, I can say, well, there must be something here because I can't put my hand through this right now. I mean, in terms of focusing my reality. So there's certain things where as somebody who's just more open and not caring so much about me, for me, it's like, oh, fuck it. Who cares? I don't really care. Oh, excuse the language. I don't really, but I don't care, right? In the long run, if evolution is real or not real. For me, the origins to all of this are only important to a point, right? It's outside of that, I think where scientists and I think religion could come together to a head is on how do we conduct ourselves and observe the world and do things as a unit. I wouldn't imagine God had put all the people on the planet here and made very intelligent people who are just wired to be scientists. I think we all know those people. They're just wired to be that type of person, right? God obviously created a person to be, I would think, that way, right? If we were all the same, this wouldn't be a very enjoyable place to be, So, if God is an all-loving God, all-just and all-knowing and seeing God, obviously he wouldn't have made mistakes in how he designed his creatures, in terms of that way. At least I wouldn't think so.
There's a study looking at creation.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say that so I believe creation.
Sure.
They look at creation to learn. So you have scientists examining certain animals.
Right, they're fascinated by it.
So that they could develop certain things that they have.
Right.
So they could develop the fast train. They look at certain animals.
Sure. They mimic, yeah.
Right. I mean, I wish I'd thought of looking at that, when I was younger, spent a lot of time in the country. You ever get those things that stick on you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yep.
Someone looked at that.
Velcro creation.
Someone looked at that and developed Velcro. Boy,
Sure.
I wish I'd been the guy to do that.
Right.
But there are a lot of things like that where people are making quote unquote inventions. They're just copying what's already there.
Right. Do you think though, because here's like a big thing, right? Because obviously I think the gist of the Bible and things like that are the morality piece. I think that's arguably the main theme is like, here's the moral structure for how life should progress. But do you think that where religious people, religions, scientists, general population, everybody can just come together? Do you think it's just because do you think it'll ever get until in your belief system revelations would occur, right? And this great big occurrence is going to happen in terms of your belief system. But let's just arguably as a private observer like myself, let's set that aside and shelf it for a sec.
Okay.
Do you think though, anywhere in your mind, do you think it would be more beneficial if everybody could just come together under a specific kind of basic moral structure and said, look, let's leave religion out of it. Let's leave the structure, the strict belief that this has to be this, and this. And scientists are doing that as well, right? Because they're like, well, you need to believe evolutionary theory. You need to believe the big, right? Leave them out of it and just say, look, let's just all go back to what's basic morality. Do you think at some point that would create a better earth? Because are people ever really, unless revelations like that would happen, are they ever really all going to come and mold into this one religion or something because of what we've seen, right?
They won't.
See what I'm saying?
Because there's different standards of morality. And that's why you see so much division in the world. You mentioned abortion.
Right.
Oh, my Lord.
They got about 10,000 opinions on the one thing.
One thing, and they want to kill each other. They're not going to come together.
Sure.
There's never going to be any real discussion or agreement. They just hate each other.
Right.
So, I mean, that's just one issue. You take all the other issues, I just don't think that people are going to come together because there's too many standards of what's
moral and what's not moral.
So, and what you have people is trying to defend their position.
Sure.
And attacking people that don't hold the same position.
That's the tough part for me is because, if I'm trying to figure out how does a society function as best as we could ever get it, if religion and once again, this is a hypothetical, so I'm not trying to rip on anybody, but if all religion was removed, if the scientific community was like, look, we're just observing what we can observe, yada, yada, not trying to push it and this and that, maybe trying to present it more as here's what we think we know based on this, right? I mean, for me, it's like, how could we ever create one world unless, like, for example, like you're saying, God would have to come down and do some gigantic thing, right? But even then, there would be a large subset of people that say, well, how do you know that's God? How do you prove that's God, or things like that? And there would still probably be arguments even then, right?
Well, even within that,
you know,
even within the religious structure, you have people arguing about what's going to happen.
because if a giant fist came down from the sky, how do I still prove that that's God? Because if there's a higher species than us, right? I love alien talk, so I won't try to dig into that. I love to talk on aliens, right? Because I think they're legit. I think they're real. But anyway, you know, like if an alien that was, if their technology was so high, they could convince lower, lowly people like us very probably easily that they're the gods of our universe, right? If they come down and they can vaporize one person and they could have some type of technology to somehow immediately raise them back from the dead or somehow, right? That would convince a lot of people to say, oh my God, that's got to be God, because they could, maybe the origins to humanity's religion was these guys, right? And they just didn't come down until they felt like we got far enough along, right? So even then you'd still have pushback. So for me as a direct observer, I guess that's a hard question for me to ask of, is there a way for everybody to come together? Because we'll never all be able to probably come under one guise. You know, not everybody's probably going to be a Jehovah's Witness. Not everybody's going to be Amish. Not everybody's going to be Hindu. Not everybody's going to, there's always going to be a melting pot because of free will and just the way people are wired. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Some people are just wired to be high scientific people. They need to have some type of scientific theorem, some dirt in the ground that they can observe under microscope. There's never going to be a time where they're going to read the Bible or Quran or something like that, and they're going to be like, oh my gosh. There's some people who will have a near-death experience, maybe, and they're super scientific, and they'll change their mind that day after having a near-death experience and meeting God. But then someone else is going to come in and say, well, if I had that same near-death experience, how do I know that that's God, even though how profound it feels? Because that's a feeling of profoundness. Maybe it's a deceiver. You know, that's right. A lot of people might say, well, that could be even the devil that was approaching you to try to pull you in or whatever like that. So, I mean, as a Jehovah's Witness, though, do you see there's any way for people to come together until in your belief system revelations would occur? Or is it just inevitable that revelations has to occur in order for anything big to change?
I think for there to be worldwide change, you know, that's what's going to happen. God's going to step in. But I'm not saying that there aren't benefits of science or there aren't people that contribute to the world, improving it, healthcare, or, you know.
Or it's something like this. Someone like myself privately can post a conversation that might change or make people think about something intriguing different.
Yeah, it's not that, you know, I feel like, you know, that's what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But I do feel like there are a lot of people who are trying to do good.
Sure.
And, you know, maybe they don't have the same belief system I do, but there's a lot of people that can contribute good. You know, there is a lot of good in science.
Of course.
You know, there's a lot of good, you know, all over the world coming from different things. Do I believe that the whole world's going to change because of them? I don't.
Mm-hmm. It's tough because I try to be optimistic about it. Sometimes I'm obviously disappointed. Recently in current events in my own life, I've been disappointed by multiple human beings on this planet about their lower morality that I obviously would not have. Yeah. Most recently, the last thing that I had happen to me, I was like, wow, I was talking to Teresa about it. I was like, man, he's just like, some of these people, I don't know how they sleep. You know, I think I told you about that last week. I'm like, how these people sleep at night doing this shit? You know, and I'm like, but obviously different moral structure. They can sleep no problem like a baby. I would be up every night feeling guilty about myself for doing some of the things that I got done recently to me.
See, we have a God-given conscience.
Sure.
But if you keep violating that conscience, eventually it's not going to bother you.
Right.
Stealing from someone's not going to bother you. Or cheating someone, or, you know, not keeping your promise, whatever it is. If you keep violating that, eventually it's going to stop being a good force in your life.
Or justifiable, right? Though you find it justifiable.
Or it's just not, you're just not going to have that, I feel bad because I did something wrong.
Sure.
If you just keep doing the wrong thing over and over and over, it's not going to function for you anymore. You're basically going to sear your conscience. It's going to be burnt. Just like if you burnt your hand and nerves are dead, you're not going to feel anything anymore. It's the same thing with your conscience. If you keep violating what you know is right and wrong, eventually it's just not going to bother you anymore.
I've been thinking about it a lot recently because obviously as people talk about revelations and things like that, and, you know, there's, interestingly enough, there, like you're talking about prophets, right? And I'm outside of like non-religious prophets, right? Nostradamus would be the one that I'm very fascinated about because he's done a lot of prediction of future events that have been highly accurate, right? To a D. And has more to come. And he has certain predictions of a similar type situation, similar to the Bible, of something major mega event that changes the entire course of humankind, right? But I digress out of that one. But it is an interesting thought process because I think humanity can go, I think mostly two ways. You know, as I think at some point we are definitely hurtling towards a apex of something quite uncomfortable for sure because of
you look at the world, it looks like it's going to blow up.
The way government goes,
So much division and
that's
hatred,
it.
and it seems like the world's going to blow up.
So I think, and this is a personal opinion, I think all that's going to hurtle to a tip, and then something very bad's going to happen, probably a mass genocide, I would imagine, you know, because the thing I've learned from the basics of history, and I just talked about this on the episode the other day, that where I'm not a great history buff, but one thing I do know is history, one, where history repeats itself, but two, humanity never changes majorly unless a massive tragedy happens, right? The world didn't come together until World War II was cooked, right? And everybody said, oh my God, I'm burnt out on war. We are so burnt out on killing each other. We got to come together, right? I mean, that was post World War II. Or, you know what I mean? So usually a great tragedy has to happen before people make major changes to how full society structures and people come together. So I think right now we are hurtling towards a massive event at some point, probably self-induced, you know, either a nuclear
Some people talk about
or,
like a
you know,
revolution and
a revolution where governments and people are against each other, or different governments. Someone finally hits the nuke button, right? We've talked about that. I mean, people have been theorizing that for quite some time. Luckily, it hasn't hit that yet.
It's more likely though.
But it's much more likely now than it has been. There's been certain periods of time where obviously we were right on the brink, like the Cold War, you're real close. But now because of technology, the amount of people, the amount of political climate, now we have a different type of cooking situation because now everybody's got access to high power technologies in every major country now. So now it's not just the U.S.
Or they could buy it illegally.
Oh yeah, you got terrorists who could buy black market nukes that probably were stolen from us because we're not watching our.
You know, you mentioned
stores
World
enough.
War II, but if you look at things historically, you know, if you start at World War One,
Sure.
you had World War One. World War II is just a continuation of that.
Oh yeah, sure.
And what we see in the world now is just a continuation of that.
Sure.
The Korean War, Vietnam, we're still, really, it was the Cold War.
Right.
And it was a battle for, you know, the same thing Hitler wanted.
Power and control
And land.
yeah, land
And resources.
sure.
Hitler had a phrase, living space or something like that. Like, you know, when he took over Poland and everything, he wanted more space for, you know, his perfect race or what, you know, whatever it was. And now Russia's doing the same thing. And really, you could say the United States is. They're all fighting. It's just been a continuation where, you know, these proxy wars where they're all trying to protect themselves and get a little more space.
Right.
And it just keeps on going.
That's the intriguing thing, because I wonder if the day is going to come, for example, where eventually they hit the button, all major governments get poofed in one day, it's all gone, right? And obviously the surviving people come together. I wonder where it'll go from there. You know what I mean? And I mean, that's kind of the big question, where does a situation like that, what does that end up brewing in the future? Does that finally create where people come together? Is it always going to be bound if something like that happened? Will people always still be divisive and things like that? Or will they then cling back to traditional religious values? Will they go back to traditional structures again? You know, that's the question I've been asking lately, is because I think we are inevitably hurtling towards a massive event like that. I just don't think it's stoppable at this point, because there's too many factors at play where we can't just hit the stop button. Even if we had 300,000 people in front of government right now, that train left the station. They're already got their plans of whatever government world takeover they want to do. And they've only shown that more
That's
recently.
why 2,000 years ago, Jesus was teaching us to pray for God's kingdom. The kingdom's a government.
Sure.
So when Christians pray that, they don't even know what they're praying for.
Right,
They're
right.
asking for God's government to come and rule the earth.
Right.
Now, if he's a loving God, just, with wisdom, and wouldn't we want that? You know, that's what I hope it comes soon. I believe it's coming soon.
Sure.
But when you look what you're saying, you know, who knows what's going to happen before then?
Right.
You know, there could be more wars. There could be, you know, who knows what.
Yeah. Well, I think that's going to
And
be.
does the
big thing.
Bible say that, you know, there's never going to be another nuclear bomb dropped? I mean, it doesn't say that.
No.
It could happen. It would be terrible. It would be horrific.
Right.
So, you know, I hope that God steps in and says, we're doing things my way.
Forward.
It's going to be,
Right.
you know, a loving, peaceful society where, you know, everybody works together and
Comes back to the original idea.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I hope it comes soon because what you said, the environment we're living in now, we see everything on the earth now.
Sure.
Years ago, we didn't know what was going on.
You had no idea over here.
Now
right?
with the social media and stuff, and it's like a powder keg.
Yeah, waiting to go.
And it's like, I hope someone doesn't put a match to that because it will blow up.
Well, and that's the crazy thing is there's a lot of people who are just regular people who are like, look, I just want a regular life. I don't want any of this complicated political climate-y stuff, right? I don't want our government to go over to this country and try to take them over. I don't want that. Why do we have, there's plenty of average Americans don't want a nuclear bomb to exist in the first place because we don't want anybody to have that kind of technology.
And the truth of the matter is,
things similar.
Do the Russian people want that?
No, I don't think
they
so.
They don't
either.
want to bomb, they don't want to bomb us, United States, and United States, the people here don't want to bomb the Russians. It's
sure.
But it's, the government's acting, I guess in the way in which they feel they're protecting their best interests. But the average person doesn't want, some sort of, mass death event.
Sure. And then that's the sad thing too, is it's interesting because, and it's kind of for me, there's a parallel there because people are, I think, replacing where there used to be a trust in God and religions. They're being replaced with trust in governments now as a religion. True. That's that replacement now is like, hey, the government says this is what we got to do, irregardless of what my personal morality or belief system feels like. And a lot of people are converting to what I would call the religion of government control and whatever. I think this last 2 years was a perfect example of how that is totally the case, including even religious people, right? There was religious people who were totally allowing their churches to be shut down or their beliefs to be squanched.
Here's the thing.
It's interesting.
We hope that the governments are going to do what's best for people.
Sure.
Right? But they're imperfect.
Right.
So they're not always going to make the best decisions just because they can't.
And they're made up of people. And as we know, people want power. They want control.
So, we could pray for things to go better, but, I don't know. Being imperfect.
Mm-hmm. I don't expect it.
Me too.
I actually think it's going to go back to more small communities. I think big events going to happen. I think there's going to be at some point, big pushback against big governments and things like that. And then I think I think it'll almost go back to like traditional tribalism where there'll be smaller communities of people self-sustaining, growing their own food, building their own little housing communities and things like that. And then intertrading. And I think it's almost going to go back I think it's going to go back to bartering systems because there's going to be a massive financial collapse because of governmental greed, right? This is a perfect example of overspending, inflation, hyperinflation, potential market crashes. Definitely a minimum, probably a recession's a minimum at this point if we're not already in the recession, and then potentially a full market crash, right? I think all of that's coming to a head at some point where we're going to go back to more traditional living. The question is going to be, what is the structure of that living going to be based around, which is where interesting talks like this come into play because many people might be going back to traditional religious beliefs, or there might be an entirely new creation of basic moral structures based on, like you said, inherent consciousness of what does it take to be a quote unquote good person, doing the right thing, whatever.
And when I talk to people, when Jehovah's Witnesses talk to people, I just encourage people to look into what the Bible says because I think it can give them hope because, there's promises in the Bible that, there'll be no more famines. Mm-hmm. There'll be no more sickness. Mm-hmm. There'll be no more death.
Sure.
No more wars. So, if you could do that study and come to the same conclusions I have that, this is from God and this is going to happen, how comforting is that?
Sure.
No more pandemics.
Sure.
No more wars. I mean, and that's just a few of the promises.
Sure, sure.
Again, respecting people's free will. People might say, I don't want to talk to you.
Well, sure.
I get that.
Well, and as a caveat for all my followers and listeners and people who eventually may see this down the line as it grows and gets bigger, you know what I mean? It's a conversation. There's nothing wrong with having, as I tell people, I'm a private observer. I ask questions. I want to talk to people of many different belief systems of all kinds. In the future, my plan is to interview scientists, interview Buddhists, interview everybody, because there's so many interesting perspectives on how things are going to be based on people's belief systems and things like that. I'm just a private observer who likes to listen and observe and ask questions. And
again, I commend you for one, trying to be the best person you can, and for two, having an open mind.
Sure. And I think that's what I try to prove with things like this, even though, it's a small portion of people that find this now. I don't think that's always going to be, I just feel deep down in my heart it's going to be big at some point. I don't know when that is. Could be 10 years, could be next year, could be tomorrow. I could all of a sudden have a video go viral and I wake up one morning and feel blessed that I wake up and I'm like, oh my God, I got like 3,000 notifications on my phone. What's going on? And I go look and I'm like, oh my God, I've got 2 million followers. What the hell happened? You know what I mean? Like that's what I'm hoping happens, right? Because I think that's an important purpose to serve, is to give these things a debate, and not a debate necessarily, but a voice. I think there's a discussion. I think we need to go back to traditional discussion. I think that's totally been lost. And that's why when you see podcasts or articles or videos or things like that are just people talking and asking questions without anybody getting mad, without anybody getting insulted, without anybody trying to force the other person to come over to their side, it's so much more enjoyable and you learn a lot more, versus nowadays it's like, well, I'm not even willing to sit down with someone who's not exactly like me.
A lot of the issues we see, the sides involved, they don't want discussion.
They can't even sit down.
No.
They won't even go in the same room and just say, look, like, here's why I think what I think. Why do you think what you think? And there's not even an attempt to try to come somewhere in the middle. You know what I mean? Like when I was talking about that Roe v. Wade thing, I'm like, there's so many ways that you could at least kind of come to the middle, where maybe neither group would be perfectly happy, but it would still be better than probably what the current thing would be, right? Like my thing was, I don't think it makes any sense for her to go all the way to 9 months. I don't think that makes sense. To me, that's a human being.
Yeah, me too.
Unarguably, because of knowing what I do actually know, because that falls into my wheelhouse of my scientific knowledge, right? I had to learn fetal development as part of what, because I work on human beings. I had to do full cadaver cut opens where I cut a full body open from skin to internal organ, right? So I had to fully dissect a human being. So that's all within my realm of my knowledge, right? And so for me, that's pretty disturbing to go something like that to 9 months, right? Where I think you could get a much better middle ground. Like that argument I made in that example was, look, being somebody who morally is trying to find my best example, but fully knowing that the earth does not function on my opinion, in order to get the best of where we could be, is you still have to come to a compromise. Unfortunately, that's just how it works. Even if I'm so sure that I've got the right answer, because someone else is going to have their side of it, I can't, you see what I'm saying? So it's like, but because people are unable to even find a middle ground, now we get something that probably is really awful, right? And so like
not even just find a middle ground,
right?
They can't even talk about it.
Well, that's the thing. And so how can you ever come up with the best solution unless you have a room full of differing opinions? Once again, instead of having the echo chambers that we have now, we no longer can have the full group. If I couldn't put 50 people in a room and just of all different opinions and probably have a super productive conversation half the time anymore, versus I think if you go back to 60s and 70s, people were at least a little bit better at that, because we've got videos even back on college campuses from like the 1970s where you have people who were like Black Panthers and white supremacists or whatever. You could put them in the same room and yet there would still be some type of discussion sometimes occurring. Whereas now there's no way you could have that. You couldn't even put a Republican and a Democrat who are hardcore in the same room and allow them to go about it without probably getting into some serious, you know what I mean? And that's basic stuff, let alone very religious people versus atheists or something like that. Good luck putting them in a room half the time and allowing that to, you see what I'm saying? It's like, versus, you have something like this where I'm trying to prove to people that you can totally have conversations like this and it doesn't have to go anywhere bad. It can totally just be a conversation that's enjoyable and I think brings value to everybody. Because for me, even though you may not have convinced me, I may not have convinced you, you might have heard one of my points and said, you know what, I'm going to go back into my Bible and I'm going to read more about that next time I get that question, I'm going to give a better answer.
There are some points that you said that I'm thinking to myself, I got to go do more research.
Well, that's it. Because you might go look in that and you say, shit, that's not a bad point. Maybe, and even though it may not have changed your opinion, you might get an even better understanding of your own beliefs, because now you're going to go into that and you say, you know what, I'm going to change my perspective on that one aspect to now next time someone asks me that question, I'm going to give a better answer than I gave this time. Now I might go back and I'm going to maybe go look into evolutionary theory again, because I haven't looked at that since basic, classes and probably high school. I can't remember when the first time you teach. You probably have elementary schools when they first teach that. So I might go back into that again and take a different look at it and say, look, Dan told me in his belief system there's this and this. Okay, well, I'm going to go look and I'm going to see, is he right about that? Is it really in that case building a theory before you look at facts versus facts before building the theory, right? So I might go look at that and say, well, okay, shit, maybe there's something to that, right? Even though I'm not convinced yet, but that's because I haven't looked at it enough yet to build a full opinion. But that should be all people, and unfortunately, that's just not what people are doing anymore. It's just like, I think I told you that the other day, or I told one of my patients where there's a YouTube channel, it's a great channel where this guy just poses a topic and he just says, look, abortion and the vaccine, my body, my choice. And then he'll put that option out there. He goes to college campus, and then he puts a spectrum of neutral to agree and strongly disagree and all the little in-betweens, and he lets people fall wherever they believe, and then he starts investigating. He just says, look, why do you believe that? What's it based on? What would it take for you to move from here to over here? You know, if you're strongly agree, what would it take for me to tell you to move from strongly agree to agree, or from agree to neutral, or from neutral to a disagree? And what I have learned, the gist of his videos is almost 9 times out of 10, people say that there is nothing you could ever tell me to move from here to even there.
They're not open to new information.
Correct. Like, even if they're still agreeing, right? That's the crazy thing. They said there's nothing you could tell me to move from strongly agree to agree, even though you still have the same opinion. It's just not as strong. There's nothing they said you could tell me. And he's like giving them hypotheticals. And even then, they're like, hypothetically, even if you told me that and could prove it to definitive whatever, I still wouldn't move from here to here.
And unfortunately,
that's crazy.
There's a word for that. Dogmatism.
Sure.
You know, if you take a position that you're never willing to challenge and just will not change your mind for any reason at all, it's dogmatic.
Yeah. And that's the crazy thing, is that's what I'm trying to encourage. I think that's why I'm not trying to do the crusader thing and say God's on my side, but I think God in many ways is going to support me in this and push this to be big, because God knows my intentions are good. And I'm just trying to grab one, I want to make a normal living out of this, because I would love that. Why wouldn't I? This would be a cool freaking job. Just like my job I have now. I have a great job now. I love my job, but this would be a great job because I love people. I love learning. This would combine a lot of things for me. Could travel the world. Why wouldn't I want to do that? Right. But God knows my intentions are good, where I'm not trying to push something. I'm just trying to give a voice to many different types of things in hopes that it will stop people from doing this dogmatism, or whatever you want to call it, altruism, another similar description word, right? I just want to open people's minds up to saying, well, maybe there's more, or maybe there's something different, or maybe I'm not right, or maybe there's
Well, I appreciate you giving me some time to speak my beliefs and why. And
sure. So
appreciate it.
That's a perfect place to cut it down, because it's an hour 45. It goes by quick. So that's another episode of the Unruly Doctor podcast, guys. So if you watch this and you found it interesting, like and subscribe to the channel, share this with somebody. Once again, you don't have to be religious to enjoy this. You know what I mean? Me not being a religious person, me being more on the spiritual side of it, I enjoyed it thoroughly. There's nothing in here where I felt attacked. There's nothing in here that I felt like, oh my gosh, like, I'm questioning my existence and all these things, right? But it gave me a lot of great things to think about today, versus I think a lot of times we're watching content online or things like that doesn't really spark your brain to think much. It's just like garbagey type things. You know what I mean? Like click for likes, click for laughs. It's not like really intriguing, deep pushing thoughts and things like that I enjoy. So, and also if you're watching the video version of this, I post the audio version of this available on Apple and Spotify at The Unruly Doctor. So yeah, that was a great episode. And thanks, Dan, for coming on.
And thank you.
Awesome.